war will visit us here on the continent. The world has changed. There is no long-term national strategy to deal with anything.
In the Ukraine conflict, maybe the U.S. was sort of exposed as being a little bit incompetent or behind what the Russian military was.
Russia has won. 1.8 million Ukrainians in uniform are dead.
Terrible.
Russia will determine what Ukraine looks like beyond the Polish border.
The most heinous, evil type of crime that you could even imagine.
Are we going to admit that our drug problem is here in the United States?
It's a serious conversation that needs to be had.
The average African warlord cares more about the people he leads in Central Africa than most of the senators and congressmen care about us. You may not have a job here anymore. Things are about to change. You know, we went through this before. It was called the Civil War.
We're living through the biggest global power shift since World War II, and most Americans don't even see it yet. Now, the rest of the world does. We see nations realigning, old alliances are cracking, the U.S. is stretched thin, and China, Russia, and the global South, they're all moving into the vacuum. Now, the question that every investor, every entrepreneur, every family should be asking is, what comes next? Because whatever this new world looks like, your wealth, your freedom, and your future is going to be shaped by it. So today, we're going to be joined by somebody who's been warning about this moment long before it hit headlines. I'm talking about Colonel Doug Macgregor. He's a career Army officer, military strategist. He's someone who's not afraid to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. We're going to talk about NATO, Ukraine. We're going to talk about Venezuela, China, the collapse of American influence. We'll talk about the global power realignment that's already underway, and most importantly, what it means for you. So let's get into it. Colonel, you've openly talked about the U.S. being financially exhausted. Right now, $38 trillion in debt and rising global commitments. What typically happens when an empire expands while its balance sheet collapses?
Well, eventually, catastrophe. But in the short run, and we're still not yet in the long run, we're getting there, but we're not there yet. I think we have to understand that our problems really began with the Vietnam War. A lot of people don't understand that Lyndon Johnson actually bankrupted the country. The cost of the Vietnam War, along with his social programs, but primarily the war, essentially bankrupted the country. And so on 15 August 1971, Richard Nixon discarded the gold standard. Now, some people say, well, why? Well, he discarded it because he couldn't pay for anything. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that historically, if you wanted to do something, if Washington wanted to spend, they had to tax the American people. There was a limit. But after 1971 and the abandonment of the gold standard, there was no limit. You needed money, you simply printed it. And as a result, over a long period of time, they printed away our savings, our income, everything, our heritage, our standard of living. They didn't print wealth. What they printed for themselves was power. So the printing press for dollars is essentially the mother of unending war. For $2 trillion in Afghanistan, over 20 years and 4 presidents, we replaced the Taliban with the Taliban, and there's no accountability. Why?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't matter to the average American. If the government had to tax us directly to bomb countries that most of us can't even find on a map, then there would be a revolution, a rebellion. But because they could print, war was invisible. The printing press also is the foundation for endless bureaucracy. When money is infinite, you can hire armies of bureaucrats. You can take 70,000 pages of federal code and turn them into 200,000. The printing press is also the source of uncontrolled immigration. They tell you it's about compassion. It isn't. It is a wage suppression operation. Why pay an American a living wage when you can import a replacement from some other place in the world, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, for half the price? So what's the result? Millions of people fled into the United States, not necessarily people we really need or necessarily want, certainly not necessarily people that are remotely interested in becoming Americans or even can be. But we drive down the cost of American labor while Washington prints money to drive up the price of their assets. So we don't have a border crisis. What we have is an economic weapon that's deployed against us. And printing money without constraint is also the mother of endless outsourcing. Fake money allows them to ship factories overseas. Behind those closed doors lie rusted towns, broken families, an opioid epidemic that kills more than 300,000 people a year, a lot more than died in Vietnam. So I think we're heading into the currency debasement problem now. And of course, this then elevates something like Bitcoin to considerable importance because we clearly cannot go back to a pure gold standard. It would be nice, but I don't think there's enough gold left in the United States, maybe not even in the world, to do it. I mean, you stop and think that in the last 22 months, we've printed 30% of all the dollars that have ever existed. Now, that's an enormous, enormous quantity of dollars. And the president smiles and says, oh, everything's just fine. Everything's getting better. All the presidents have done that. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. And they say, well, this is capitalism. This is a free market. No, it's not. Capitalism requires competition, periodic failure, or creative destruction. So in this current environment, given the ability to sort of inject liquidity, whatever you like, or quantitative easing, call it what you will, when big business fails, Washington prints money to bail it out. Now, that assumes that if you're in big business, you have the right friends in Washington. And if you aren't big business and you don't have friends in Washington, you're foreclosed. So I think that's a good way to look at the problem that we have right now. And there's no easy way out. And nobody wants to default because that could have profound consequences. So what do? We continue to print, and we have a very elaborate game involving balance sheets and bonds and T-bills, and now the stablecoin business is another scam in my judgment. It's not Bitcoin. And why would anybody want to invest in stablecoin if each coin is worth $1? Well, forget it. Let's all buy Bitcoin. Forget stablecoin, right? Anyway, I think those things are coming together.
Yeah.
These forces are converging. Now, the other part of this is, in addition to running out of wealth, which is effectively where we don't produce anything. What do we manufacture? We manufacture some military equipment, but much beyond it, no. Our manufacturing base was driven out of the country. So we're trying to restart that, but that's not something you snap your fingers and change. It's going to take a long time. What have we done in the energy industry? What have we done for agriculture? Those two things used to be pillars in the high church of productivity and wealth in the United States. We're not getting nearly out of energy or out of the agrarian sector, in my judgment, what we need. There needs to be a focus on that. You know, just look at mining. We talk about mineral wealth, and we're worried about rare earths. Now we found some rare earth deposits up in Alaska, but I've got news for you. There's rare earth all over Canada. There's rare earth in the United States. But we haven't bothered to do anything with it. Why? Well, it wasn't financially rewarding. It was cheaper, faster, better to go somewhere else. And the worst part is we don't even have a refinery for the stuff. So where do we send our rare earths to be refined? Time's up. China. You know, so it goes to China or, you know, Kazakhstan. I don't know if Mongolia has an operating refinery right now, but we haven't built one. You know, we need to build one. It's crazy. And we have friends that are sitting on enormous rare earth deposits that nobody ever bothers to mention. Norway has perhaps the largest rare earth department in all of Europe. So I think we've just got problems in Washington because there is no long-term national strategy to deal with anything. There's no long-term national strategy for military purposes, none for scientific industrial development, none for mineral wealth and extraction, none for agriculture, none for energy. Everything is ad hoc, last minute, short term. And that's not surprising because every 4 years, what do we do in Washington? Every 4 or 8, it depends on how long the president lasts. Well, we lobotomize the government. You know, we say, oh, well, everything they did was wrong. Now we're going to do all of these things. Well, it doesn't really change the country. The country remains the same thing, but there is no framework for development, no framework for improvement. So I think at this point, I think we're on the road to what Nassim Taleb calls perhaps the mother of all black swans.
Well, that's a really good frame, and it all kind of starts with your case for sound money, which I thought was really well put. The interesting historical fact is that the first central bank that was created was the Bank of England in the late 1600s. That was created specifically so they'd have more money to continue to fight wars.
Right.
So it was started so they could print money so they could just keep these never-ending wars going. And that's what we've seen. And you mentioned, spending $2 trillion in Afghanistan. So while the U.S. government certainly has the power of the money printer and can continue to print essentially at this point endless amounts of money to fight these wars, the symptom of that, as you mentioned, then it also requires sort of maybe hollowing out the manufacturing base, which I think brings us to maybe a more crucial point you're talking about, not being able to refine our own rare earth elements and things like that. So currently, right now, the U.S. has this massive amount of debt. The money printer is still working at this point. It's having diminishing returns. But maybe the real crux or maybe pain point that we have right now with being able to sort of project power globally is not just in the money or the debt that we have, but the ability to even fight a war, to even be able to produce the goods that we need. You've heard me talking about investing in layers and things like the reason you have to work so hard is because your money doesn't. Well, I want to invite you to a special event I'm having, a 3-day live event called the Wealth Operating System. It's an accelerator event where I'm going to teach you all the tools that the 1% use to have their money work harder than they do. Getting their money to do 1 job, 2 jobs, 3, 5 jobs at once so it can work faster and harder than you. Over 3 days, we're going to go deep. I'm going to bring in guest speakers. It's workshop style. I got about 15 tools, and we're going to go through a methodical process so you can learn how to reclaim 10 to 15 hours of your time back per week, how to keep more of your money, how to invest it and multiply it faster than you've ever imagined. And by the end of it, you'll have a 90-day plan of exactly what you need to do to go make 2026 the best year you've ever imagined. It's all going to be live. It's all going to be virtual. There's a link down below if you want to come check out. I'll put a QR code up on the screen. If you want to get your money working harder than you do to grow your wealth faster than you've ever imagined, like the 1%, check out the Wealth Operating System Accelerator event. Check out the link down below.
Well, I think your British analogy merits closer attention because you're right. They created the Bank of England for those purposes. It was also the strategic engine in many ways, at least in monetary terms, for the founding and expansion of the British Empire. But having said that, Britain did recognize limits and constraints, and they operated within these limits and constraints. They understood the criticality of gold backing their currency. And so they were able to be part of various alliances and coalitions that defeated various enemies, whether it was Louis XIV or Napoleon Bonaparte. And they were able to do it without enormous loss of life and without fielding enormous forces. The large forces that did most of the fighting were always continental, largely German-speaking and Russian-speaking armies, connected with some others on the periphery, but those were the main ones to defeat these French forces. That changes in 1914, and a very, very bad decision is made, and that decision was to intervene in the First World War, something for which the British were not prepared and could not sustain. And by 1917, it was pretty obvious to anybody looking at the facts on the ground that France and Britain were losing. Mm-hmm. And so the pressure for the bankers was enormous for us to come into the war and ultimately bail out the French and British imperialists. So we ended up doing that. It had terrible consequences for us because we destroyed Europe and we eliminated the major powers in Central East Europe that held the European civilization together. Mm-hmm. Wherever we have intervened historically, we have distorted the natural dynamic forces in the area, which ultimately determined how people would be governed and how people would live. And that's been disastrous because we are, much like Great Britain, ultimately a maritime and aerospace power. We are not a continental military power anywheres, but in the Western Hemisphere. So like the British, we've never had a requirement for a very large army, and having to field large armies, especially during and after World War II, was an expense for which we weren't prepared. And we had to sustain this all through the Cold War. which was frankly not a good thing. I mean, people don't realize how much of our wealth was squandered on containing the Soviet Union. So here we sit at the end of this whole process in 1991. We saw ourselves as having, quote unquote, won the Cold War. In reality, the Soviet structure simply collapsed. It didn't make any sense. State socialism was a disaster. There was an opportunity then to do a lot of things that made sense. The first was to get out of NATO, or at least set NATO up to operate without us.
Right.
You know, NATO is kind of like, I'm sure some of you have contracts with ADT. This is a nationwide security service that comes to your phone and wires your doors, your windows, and then you have an alarm system. Well, NATO has been the ADT analog for Europeans now for almost 70, 65 years, and they've never had to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's the problem. They say, oh, well, that's not true. We put money here and here. Let me tell you, it's a pittance. I served most of my military career in Europe. I lived over there for 10 years, went to school there, served there twice, 3 times actually, twice in Germany and then once in Belgium. We provided free of charge ADT for the Europeans. And oh, by the way, we've provided ADT free of charge for Japan. And to a lesser extent, Korea. The Koreans did join us in Vietnam, tried to reduce the burden on us there, but not Japan. Japan's national strategy has been to extract as much wealth as possible from us and get a defense for it without paying for any of it. And it's worked. So what Donald Trump has been saying and is now saying publicly, this needs to end. And of course, you know, you're dealing with countries, especially in Europe, that have been spoiled rotten like children. And they don't want us to leave. They want us to continue to pay for everything and protect them for nothing. Now, there are a lot of people in Washington that don't like it because in Washington, everything is mortgaged to vanity as well as money. That means everybody likes the fact that we have U.S. forces all over the world. People like to stand up and talk, and even President Trump does this, which is really annoying, frankly. We have the greatest armed forces in the world. Nobody can stand against us. Well, if you're like the British before World War I and you skillfully avoid fighting anybody who can really fight back, you look pretty good. And Britain looked pretty good in 1914 until it faced the Imperial German Army, and the rest is history. Same thing happened again in World War II. So your point is accurate. We're really not organized, trained, equipped, and ready or structured to go after anybody who is a near-peer opponent, if you will, or a peer opponent. And I hope people begin to understand that. And the answer to that is not to pour money into the old structure and the old defense establishment because we need a new one. It's to cut back on spending, defense spending, figure out what it is that we need, and then build that, and then steer a different course in foreign policy. And that course is war avoidance. You mention that in Washington, and people look at you and say, what? Conflict avoidance? Well, why?
Yeah.
Because war will visit us here on the continent. It's not what it was. The world has changed. The technologies we once enjoyed a monopoly over have now proliferated. War is dangerous. The last president who really understood that was Eisenhower. And he understood that World War II was no great march to victory without massive, massive loss of life and, this disruption of our way of life. So, you put together the end of the fiat system, which I think is staring us in the face, or its collapse, together with this giant force that's not really the force we need for the future. It happens to be the force that we've used for the past 50, 60 years to pulverize anybody we didn't like and bully people into submission. How do we rectify this? And that's where you come into a discussion of where do we go from here financially. And
Right.
I don't really feel competent to discuss that in detail, but I think Bitcoin fits into that because the fiat system is not going to survive, not in its current form.
Right. When you talked about the British Army looked strong until they met the German Army, and sort of the U.S. is sort of looked strong. if you look at it, and I think, I've heard many of your interviews talking about this, sort of the U.S. was sort of put on a global stage, well, 2 times maybe. So I've heard of like the generations of warfare. Maybe the 3rd generation of warfare was like the industrial armies of like World War I and World War II. 4th generation sort of being maybe starting in Vietnam, more of like a guerrilla type warfare. And so if you look at like from Vietnam forward, I mean, how many of these wars have we been winning from the U.S. side? But then maybe more specifically in the Ukraine conflict, maybe the U.S. was sort of exposed as being a little bit incompetent or behind maybe what the Russian military was.
Oh, I think it has been. It's been very much exposed. Now, how profoundly has that affected our standing in the world? It'll take time to sort that out. The quickest way to demonstrate, the weakness of the United States strategically would be to disable or sink an aircraft carrier. People don't realize the enormous impact of the loss of the Prince of Wales, its giant British battleship that had been sent along with a cruiser by Churchill to Singapore in 1942. And at the time, the admirals told Churchill, don't do this. They're at risk. And he said, what do you mean they're at risk? These are the greatest warships in the world. He said, yeah, but they don't have any air cover. And their air defenses on board the vessels are inadequate. And he said, nonsense. Well, we know what happened. The Japanese found it. They flew out to it and they sank it. That was the beginning of the end of the British Empire. And then subsequently, we have the defeat at Singapore, which pretty much nailed the coffin shut. So those kinds of events matter. We haven't really experienced that yet, but that doesn't mean we could very easily and very suddenly. One example, I think, of course, are the Houthis. Look at the success the Houthis had against the United States Navy in the Red Sea. Well, was that the fault of the sailors on the ships that they weren't able to avoid being struck and they weren't able to damage fatally the Houthis? No, of course not. They're simply in the wrong vessels, doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons with the wrong weapon systems. This is years and years of negligence. It's also years and years of continuing to buy the same things and spending money on the same things that we always have, because that makes people inside the Beltway wealthy. That makes the donors happy. It creates money. It doesn't help us in defense, which is why spending more money for defense is not an answer. It matters how you spend it and on what you spend.
Right.
It also matters the quality of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that you have, the quality of discipline and leadership. So, I think your question is a valid one, and I would say yes, we have been exposed to some extent, and I don't see any evidence that we are seriously examining what has been exposed. I really don't. I don't think the majority of the people I talk to has still all sorts of fantasies about what is really happening on the ground in eastern Ukraine and what isn't. Complete failure to understand what the Russians have really done. And I think it's unfortunate, but there's not much that we can do about it. It's very, very hard to take a power with the kinds of armed forces we have and persuade the people that lead it to pay attention to reality on the ground, especially if that reality is so radically different from what they imagine.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, in life, sometimes you have to take a loss or hit rock bottom before you change direction. And certainly we hope it doesn't come to that point. But kind of talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you said that the conflict is essentially over, but maybe just not officially. Now, there are some terms of a treaty that have been proposed. It looks like that's coming to a head. But you said it is essentially over, just reality hasn't caught up to that.
Well, the opportunity to have influenced this positively in a way that would have led to peace and stability was lost a long time ago, because the people in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, the globalists that are ruling us, weren't really interested in peace. The problem that President Trump has is, I think he is, but he doesn't control Congress, and Congress has no interest in peace. The Senate and the House are happy if we continue to spend wastefully on what's happening in Ukraine, as are the people in Western Europe. Now, the reason in Europe's a little different. I think the Europeans still delude themselves into believing that they can harm Russia. But the sanctions haven't really had the desired impact. Whatever impact they had was rapidly balanced out by other actions. And we found that most countries in most cases can find a way around sanctions. So that's not really our interest anymore. I think that President Trump really would like to normalize relations with Russia and be on a better footing, sure footing with the Russians than we are. I just don't know that he can make it happen. And if you look at these 28 points, I think somebody pointed out to me recently, well, if you want to read the 28 points that have now been reduced to 19 that are probably going to become 10, you need to go to the men's room in the Kremlin and look at the current version on the wall, because it's meaningless. Russia has won. Russia will determine what Ukraine looks like, what Eastern Europe looks like beyond the Polish border. That's a foregone conclusion. The Russians have no interest in conquering Eastern Europe, never have. They don't even want to move much beyond where they are right now. They want to get on with business as usual. They would like, I think, to have good relations with us for the same reason we would like to have good relations with them.
Mm-hmm.
But again, President Trump had the opportunity after he took over to say, look, I didn't start this. I don't like it. I don't see any value in it, and I'm going to end it. And the only way for this to end is if I, in Washington, pull the plug. I halt the flow of funds and equipment to Ukraine. This will compel the Europeans and the Ukrainians in Kiev to reach some sort of deal.
Mm-hmm.
Because as long as we continue to support them, they are simply not incentivized for peace. And they don't care how many millions of people that are killed. 1.8 million Ukrainians is about the latest number I've gotten. 1.8 million Ukrainians in uniform are dead.
Terrible.
And we don't care. We don't care.
Yeah.
I don't see any evidence that anybody on the Hill gives a damn.
Yeah.
In fact, I've begun to think that the average African warlord cares more about the people he leads in Central Africa than most of the senators and congressmen care about us, Americans, let alone the Ukrainians.
Yeah, they're so detached from it. But I think it has seemed like Trump has tried to pull the plug, as you said. But to your point, maybe the neocons and the warmongers in Congress keep pushing forward on that. But
we haven't stopped the money.
Right.
We haven't stopped the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance information that is vital and essential to anything that the Ukrainians want to do. Haven't done that. We haven't halted all the equipment, although the equipment that's promised that the Europeans are now being expected to pay for probably won't arrive for 2 or 3 years.
Is some of that maybe just to keep a little bit of pressure on to get Putin to tell us what his terms are going to be to reach that peace agreement?
He's already done that. He's told us his terms for 3+ years.
Okay.
It's not a secret. There's no pressure on Putin anymore.
Yeah.
None. There might have been 2 or 3 years ago, because at that point, the Russian military was much smaller. They hadn't yet geared up. Their manufacturing base was not running at full speed. Right now, Russia is mobilized for war. And if they're pushed by the Europeans stupidly, they'll mobilize for total war. And I'll tell you that Putin is right. A war between our European allies and the Russians would end very quickly. And it wouldn't end well for the Europeans. Again, it takes at least 10 years just to build an army.
Right. A lot of this then hinges on NATO. You're mentioning Russia and the Europeans. You talked about, for a long time, the U.S. footing the bill for NATO. Trump has been very vocal about getting every country to pay their fair share. They haven't. Lately, just in the last couple of weeks, I've been seeing this increasing rhetoric around the U.S. leaving NATO, but not for the reasons that we typically would think about. It's not so much about, hey, it's a relic of the Cold War. Hey, they're not paying their fair share. Now it's like, we don't even share aligned values with any of these countries any longer. So that seems to be the rhetoric I'm seeing popping up. I'm curious your take on that. Every day we see headlines about inflation and debt and diminishing control over our own money. That's why I always come back to Bitcoin, because it's built for generations. It's built for legacy. But protecting your Bitcoin legacy the right way, it's not always simple. It demands discipline, focus, and the right partner. Now, that's why I personally use Unchained Signature. It's a premium private client service for serious Bitcoin holders who want expert guidance, resilient custody, and an enduring partnership. Now, with Signature, you're paired with your own dedicated account manager, someone who understands your goals, helps you every step of the way. You're going to get white glove onboarding, same-day emergency support, personalized education, reduced trading fees, and priority access to exclusive events and features. Unchained's collaborative custody model is designed to provide the same security as the world's biggest Bitcoin custodians, but for those who prefer to hold their own keys. Now, I've been using and recommending Unchained for years. I even got my parents to set up with them. So if you want to get set up, check out Unchained Signature at unchained.com/MarkMoss. And as a loyal listener, I got a discount for you. Just use code MOSS10 at checkout to get 10% off your first year, because your Bitcoin isn't just for life, it's for generations.
Well, first of all of the problems that President Trump points to with regard to the massive impact of migrants that have flooded in from Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, so forth, we have it too.
Yeah, of course.
We have the same thing here. Who's he kidding? He needs to stop. And I mean, if you live in a glass house, and we are in one, it's probably not a good idea to hurl those stones.
Well, he's been calling out Dearborn, Michigan. He's been calling out the Somalis in Minnesota as well.
Yeah, of course. But what are we going to do about it?
Right.
And see, the Europeans, they're in it's an existential question for them. 1 out of every 5 adults in France is a Muslim. Now, that means he's a Muslim from Africa or the Middle East in all probability. All right, and you do the math. Look at the birth rates.
Right.
So either they find a way to expel these people, or that's the end of France. And French-speaking civilization and culture is one of the foundations of the West. It could go away. Don't kid yourself.
Right.
Italy is not in the greatest shape. It's not as bad as France. Germany has its own set of problems. Once again, not quite as bad as France. What he is saying to them is something that we need to come to terms with. If you want to survive, you've got to defend yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to defend yourselves internally.
Right.
Determine what you will and won't tolerate. Look, you mentioned Dearborn. Let's talk about Chicago and Governor Pritzker in Michigan, who effectively says that ICE is a terrorist organization, that he's openly rebelling against the federal government.
Right.
Now, we went through this before. It was called the Civil War. I thought we settled that question. But this is not a good thing. This is destructive to the body politic. This is very serious threat to national cohesion. And President Trump needs to focus there, which is why I have argued for a long time, get the troops out, bring them home, get them back into the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Let's ratchet down the operational tempo. Just imagine these poor bastards who were over in the Mediterranean in the Navy. They were over there for a few months. Now they've sailed down to the Caribbean, and they're sort of sitting around sailing there. This wears you out. These are human beings. They have to perform. They have to operate the systems. They have to make it all work. We seem to have lost touch with these things. But here they sit, and no decision seems to have been made. And I still haven't figured out what we expect to accomplish in Venezuela. Again, are we going to admit that our drug problem is here in the United States?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
You can bomb the hell out of Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, anything you want. What are you doing about it here?
I heard someone say it's like, these other countries, whether it's China with their fentanyl or Venezuela, whatever country you want to put onto it, like their job sort of is to destabilize us. Our job is to not be destabilized. Right?
No, you're exactly right. And I don't think, first of all, China, people do, I don't know how much time you spend in Northeast Asia, but very few Americans understand Asia. It bears no resemblance to our world. They could just as easily be on a different planet. That's how different Asia is from the United States and the West. The Chinese have no interest in a war with us under any and all circumstances. They don't want a war with anybody. If the Chinese live in fear of something, I think they live in fear that the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy will come back. I don't think they fear us militarily. Now, they are prudent people, and we have made it very clear that if we choose to do so, we can blockade all of China's ports. We've threatened those things in the past. We have been very, very aggressive towards China militarily, so the Chinese have invested heavily in this One Belt, One Road.
Mm-hmm.
And what is One Belt, One Road? It's a Eurasian network of transportation and communication that the United States Navy can't disrupt.
Right.
They've done what they can to protect themselves against the things that we might do to them. I don't think President Trump wants anything to do with a war against China. And I think privately he's figured out If you tried to defend Taiwan against a determined attack by the Chinese, you're going to lose.
Right.
That's 6,000 miles from the United States. This was the problem with going to Ukraine. Where is Ukraine? It's on Russia's doorstep. Who are we kidding? That's a war they can't lose. That's like saying, well, the Russians and the Chinese are going to jointly develop a Mexican military establishment designed to invade the United States and retake the lost territories from the Mexican War in 1846.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Right.
We could crush that quickly. They're not stupid.
Right.
So, there's an awful lot of irrational behavior. There's too much emotion, not enough thinking, and not enough honesty about what the hell our problems are.
Doesn't it look like there's been a renewed push maybe for this, if you call it the Monroe Doctrine, but sort of it seems like Trump has been saying, okay, we're done being all over the world, done in the East, in China, and let's just focus on the Northern Hemisphere?
No, he didn't say northern. He said western.
Okay, sorry. That's what. Okay.
Talk is cheap, Bart. Sounds great. Let's see what happens. That's my first remark. An awful lot of hot air in Washington about doing things or not doing things, and I've been listening to it for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So I think these are great ideas. Let's see some implementation.
Sure.
There's nothing in that national security strategy that talks about implementation. There is no framework for action. They're just assertions. This is the way I feel. I don't think we should be there. Great. I don't think we should be there either. Okay, so now what? This is the so what, now what? The now what is missing. And I think that's what we need desperately. Now, maybe he'll provide that, but I haven't seen it.
It goes back to how you opened up and about, now whatever 50, 60 years of endless money printing and what all the consequences of that, one of which you pointed out very correctly, which is this massive expansion of the bureaucracy inside the government and all of that. And so you kind of get to this point where we're at now. It's like, the government's not a monolith. So it's like there could certainly be many people who would be happy to sort of withdraw back to the Western Hemisphere. But to your point, we got the neocons, the warmongers, you have the bureaucracy. And so I'm guessing it's much harder than it sounds, right? Easier said than done sort of thing.
Well, I'm not sure that you can do it with the current government that we've got. And remember that you do have a number of forces inside the government, in the court system, on the Hill, inside the federal bureaucracy, who are going to fight you to the death.
Right.
Because you are potentially telling them, you may not have a job here anymore. Things are about to change. Our policies are about to change. It's like you get into a discussion about illegal immigration. Oh, I don't think we should have borders. Everyone who wants to come here should be allowed to come here. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And we all know that's not going to work. But then you say, well, wait a minute, why can't we hire Americans to do these jobs? Oh, Americans don't want to do that. Well, I have 2 sons. And when they were growing up, they went to work. You know where they worked? They worked at a large food produce store, something like Giant or Harris Teeter. And they stacked vegetables. Mm-hmm. And they recovered carts. Mm-hmm. They did all the things that Americans don't want to do. That's nonsense. Secondly, one of them went into IT, and he did very well. And he worked in a company where he was one of 3 or 4 Americans in a company of 400 people from India. And he came back to me and he said, Dad, we don't have to bring in these Indians. There are Americans who will do these jobs. But he says, you've got to pay them a living wage.
Right.
These people are brought over here. They're paid nothing. They're treated badly by their own people. He said, it's awful. He didn't like it at all. And he said, these are not bad people, but he said, I can go out this afternoon and find 10 Americans for 20 or 30 foreigners, and they'll do the software work, the coding, the software engineering, all of that extremely well. We have a lot of schools now that have set up excellent training courses to train Americans to do these things.
Yeah.
So we got to get out of this. Well, if you say that, you're a racist. If you say that, you're this. I'm so tired of hearing people called Nazis, communists, racists, whatever, bigots. These people don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. I think it's 2-part, and you're absolutely right. But the second part of that is that when you're paying people $50,000, $60,000 a year to sit at home and do nothing, They
Yeah.
also don't want to go do that job. Why would I want to go stack produce for 15, 20 bucks an hour when I can just make 30, 40 bucks an hour doing nothing? And then with the immigration, then, it's something like 60. I hate, I don't want to be fact checked on my own show, but it was something like 65% of illegal immigrants were like on welfare.
Yeah, well, that's because we don't even have control of the Social Security system. Remember when Elon Musk went in there with his team, and then he was castigated and attacked by everybody
Yeah.
for turning up the truth?
Yeah.
That what you had 20 million, 30 million, 40 million people receiving benefits that didn't even exist.
Right. Yeah.
Come on.
And I looked like, so we have immigration rules that have, and our founding fathers talked about the dangers of bringing in too many immigrants at one time that couldn't assimilate. We've been talking about this since the founding of the country. And currently there's a rule, I believe it's only 650,000 immigrants per year. And over the last 5 years, we've doubled that legally. And then illegally, it's, whatever it is, 10, 15 million on top of that.
Well, here's a factoid for you, and I'm trying to find the book here because I've found it so useful. I've learned so much about it. It's about the growth of the United States. It explains our climb to economic power. And it points out that our greatest leap economically as a scientific industrial power occurred between 1924 and 1970. And the author points out that from 1924 until the 1950s, we had no immigration. None. However, we did have a law on the books, and it was called the Exceptional Skills Act. And that law said that if the individual who wants to come into the country has skills and abilities that we can utilize, that can be a benefit to the American society, then that person can be admitted.
Right.
That's how we got Einstein.
Yeah.
If you start going down the list of the people that did come in, they were superstars. They were wonderful. And then immigration starts to pick up again. But then in 1965, we changed the laws. We threw a lot of things out. We opened the floodgates. It didn't really affect us until the 1980s, frankly. But then remember that Ronald Reagan then issued amnesty to all of the people from Latin America that were here illegally. And they said, well, that'll solve the problem. Nobody will come anymore.
Right.
That's when it spiked.
Right.
So, the immigration thing is not what it appears to be. And now if all of the projections and predictions for AI are accurate, then the last thing you need are people coming into this country that don't read and write, even in their own languages, people that are not skilled, people that are not well educated. Somebody said, well, you just don't like Mexicans. I said, no. I'll stand on the border and invite every Mexican into the United States that has a degree in applied mathematics. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
Yeah.
By the way, and preferably speaks English. They said, well, that's unreasonable. No, it isn't. More people in China speak English than inside the United States.
What?
Yes.
Wow. That's a shocking.
More people in China can speak English than speak English here. That's if you have 350 million and you assume that everybody speaks English, there are more Chinese that speak English than we have living in the United States.
Wow.
People.
That's a shocking statistic. I think
So there's no excuse for not speaking English anymore. We can set that standard.
the world has, and probably social media is, I'm sure, very partly or massively to blame for this, but we've lost the ability to have even just civil discourse, but more specifically like nuance, where it's like, I can be 100% pro-immigration. I can be 100% pro-immigration, but not want to bring everybody. We could just separate those two things.
Well, I think I understand your point, but I think we're beyond that now. I think things are going to get ugly.
Yeah.
And again, it's back to the economy.
Right.
We've hollowed out the economy. Now we're talking about AI. And people are saying already that AI is going to cause massive layoffs. I've seen predictions for the coming year. Well, if that's true, we really have to sit down and very carefully scrutinize who is here. We think there are 52 million people inside the United States who were not born here. And of that number, we may have 30 plus million that are illegal.
Right.
Well, if we're looking at this AI avalanche that's going to fall on everybody, and it's going to eliminate jobs what are we doing in immigration?
It's a serious conversation that needs to be had. I want to jump back a little bit more. We'll stick in the Western Hemisphere, a topic you've been talking about quite a bit lately, and I'm pretty interested in. Hopefully we've talked about the Russia-Ukraine thing, and to your point, it's sort of been resolved. We just don't know it yet. But now we have this situation going on in Venezuela. There's a lot of attack going on with Trump and Hegseth because they're bombing the narco boats. And what's your take on what's going on? Why are we involved in trying to take out drug boats there? Is it more than just drugs, in your opinion?
I don't think the drug business has much to do with it. You can certainly make an argument that the banks in Venezuela have helped to launder money involved in the drug trade. But then again, you could make that argument about Hong Kong, Grand Cayman. I think this has more to do with, frankly, resources, especially when you look at oil, gas, gold mines, emerald mines, rare earths, and so forth. I do think there are people in Washington that truly believe that if we can install a puppet government down there that will be responsive to us, that we can then gain undisrupted, uninterrupted access to all of those resources, and that those resources can even be collateralized and perhaps help to offset this tremendous debt problem that plagues us. I'm not sure how you do that. I haven't figured it out. And the other thing is that even if you were able to get in there and put a government in that you say is friendly to you, this Mrs. Machado or whomever else, how do you stop people that decide they don't like you and don't want you and start to blow up your oil rigs, who throw explosives into, mines? The country is enormous. It's the size of Germany, Austria, France combined. The population, depending upon which source you go to, is 28.5 million to 30 million. I mean, this is enormous. It has a 1,380-mile border with Colombia, a 1,380-mile border roughly with Brazil. If you go in there, the Colombians have already said that they'll support the Venezuelans against us, even though they don't like the Venezuelans. They have real conflicts.
Right.
The Brazilians, they have perhaps 50 to 100,000 paramilitaries that they can send across the border from Brazil. I mean, do we want to turn this into some sort of Latin American crusade against the evil Yankees who are back trying to exploit us?
Right.
I mean, I think that's a bad idea. I don't see this being necessary or good. But again, another reason that's given, we have to show those Chinese and Russians we're in charge and they need to get out of Venezuela. Okay, good luck with that. Let's assume that you can do that. What's going to prevent them from coming back, 5 years from now or 10 years from now? We do live on a planet that is increasingly globalized. Trade is globalized. Commercial activity is globalized. We're all doing business.
Yeah.
Surely there's a way to resolve some of this tension. You mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. I'm glad you did, because everybody has been taught for years how important this is. When President Monroe mentioned that, everybody nodded and thought this was interesting, but at the time when he was president, everybody knew we had no army. We had very little navy. There was no way for us to enforce any of it. The first time it comes up for serious discussion, believe it or not, is in the 1920s. And people said, well, we've got to be sure that our hemisphere is free of infiltrators that could be anarchists, communists, socialists, later on fascists, and so forth.
Right.
But it never had that much teeth. And I think we're deluding ourselves. I don't think we can wall off South America or Central America from everybody who's not in the Western Hemisphere.
Right. What about, General Mike Flynn has been talking about color revolution happening inside the United States. We see there's the seditious six that are telling the military they could stand down and not, disobey unconstitutional orders. So we see these things going on. You talked about Pritzker saying ICE is a terrorist organization. So this idea that Mike Flynn is talking about, General Flynn is talking about with this color revolution. And there's a lot of people talking about how Venezuela it's not about the resources there. It's really about their role in this deep state, in this CIA black ops. We have this El Pollo, there's a couple people who have now come from Venezuela that are giving the U.S. intel on this. And it seems that maybe this isn't an attack on resources. It's more about an attack on that deep state, kind of shutting down this insurrection. Have you seen that? Do you think there's any, smoke fire there? Governments will never stop printing money, so inflation, it's not going away. Now, if your money's not earning at least 10% a year, you're losing purchasing power. Now, that's why I talk about Bitcoin. It's the number one way to beat inflation and secure your future. And the question I get asked almost every day is, where do you buy your Bitcoin? Now, for years, I've personally used river.com, and I only take on sponsors that I use and I trust. And I trust them because River's Bitcoin only, they have 100% reserve, and they keep your Bitcoin safe in cold storage with no middlemen. And you can actually talk to a real person, a US-based support dedicated manager. Now, try getting that peace of mind from Coinbase. Of course you can't. Now, the perks, if you set up auto buys, you can pay 0 fees. Plus, instead of your bank paying you, 0.4% on cash, River pays you 3.75% on cash paid in Bitcoin. So if you're ready to build your Bitcoin position with confidence, go to river.com/markmoss and get up to $100 in Bitcoin when you sign up. Because freedom starts when you own your money, and your money starts with Bitcoin.
Well, I'm familiar with the allegation that Dominion software was developed under Hugo Chavez for his purposes, and that it was used in the United States allegedly to rig the last election or the next to last election for the presidency against Trump. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be the case. I just don't know very much about it. I do know that there was a lot of irregularity, and there still is, in the system in the United States. I think voting integrity is a huge issue, a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And I don't think it was solved this last time around.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't know. Now, as far as the 6 senators and congressmen, whatever they were, that was a shameless attempt to undermine the authority of the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States. That's all. You don't have to follow an order. Well, I've got news for you. If you're in the regular armed forces of the United States, you damn well are going to have to follow the order. Now, illegal. Well, what illegal order are you being issued? I did not have illegal orders issued to me while I was on active duty for 28 years. However, I did see a case of an illegal order. That was favorably resolved, but it's a very difficult proposition. Now, what they were talking about should be divorced from what we now know about these drug boats. First of all, if you follow our own law of war and our own national law, we should not be destroying these boats in international waters. Somebody sent me an email and said, well, there's no flag on it. If there's no flag, it's free game. You can blow them up. No, you cannot. We are not under our own laws. We're not even talking about the UNCLOS, the law of the sea. I'm talking about American law. You do not have the right in the United States Navy or Coast Guard to simply see a vessel and say, well, it's not flying a flag, so we can blow it up. Now, under certain circumstances, you can board it and inspect it. And one of the things that we have not seen since this got underway is any attempt to stop, board, and inspect. And I'm very suspicious of that. This take no prisoners approach, which is allegedly what happened, kill the remaining 2 that are alive, strikes me as an attempt to ensure no one can survive and explain who or what they are. And I don't know if you know this or not, but in war, as well as in peacetime, you always want to capture people. That's how you find things out.
Right.
So had I been there, my concern would absolutely rescue these people. Let's find out who they are. Where did they come from? And you can do that. But I'm beginning to think that people don't want to find out that particular truth.
Right.
Because we know historically, if you go to the DEA's website, look at Venezuela, Mexico, these other places, less than 4% of the illegal drugs that do come out of Venezuela come to the United States. Whatever it does, for the most part, goes to Africa and Europe. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. We don't care about the rest of it. But if you compare the fentanyl influx into the United States that comes out of Mexico, it's nothing. And quite recently, there was a raid up on Port City called Traverse Port City in Michigan. They found 3.8 tons of drugs. Most of it was fentanyl it had come in through Michigan from the Great Lakes from the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico.
Wow.
Now, this was a brilliant operation. People should look into it. The federal marshals, the local police, it was a great operation. We were successful. But my point is, that's where we need to focus, not in Venezuela. Bombing Venezuela, I would argue bombing Mexico is not going to help us deal with this drug problem. Sealing off the border, keeping people out. And by the way, we have a huge problem at the legal crossing points because we don't pay customs officers, let alone border patrolmen, enough money.
Right.
And what happens is the cartel comes in and we'll pay you $30,000 extra a month. Just let this truck through. What's he going to do?
Right.
You know, we're not realistic about these things. We have not sealed off the coastlines by any means. These semi-submersibles have been around for years. They continue to operate. They can bring in all sorts of things, people, drugs. One of the things when I was involved in this down in Key West at Joint Integrated Task Force South, GIATF South, Joint Interagency Task Force South, excuse me, we were very worried about the possibility that people infected with terribly infectious and dangerous deadly diseases could be brought in on semi-submersibles right into Mobile Bay, offloaded in Mobile Bay, and then wander around in the United States until suddenly somebody becomes very ill and they discover, wow, my God, it's smallpox.
Right.
And then you find that how many people has this person touched and been near? I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
Border and coastal security. And then you go to the airports. And what are we doing in the airports? I'm not saying we're doing nothing. What I'm saying is you got to enforce this.
Yeah.
You've got to enforce the law there, but you got to enforce the law inside the United States.
Yeah.
What do you do when you catch two men that have 13 children, little children, that are being trafficked, that are brought up from Mexico, and you catch them in Phoenix, Arizona? What do you do with a truck driven by two people, and they're bringing up enormous quantities of drugs? They pull into a warehouse, and the drug peddlers come in to collect their wares so they can disseminate them, and you capture them. They're all found guilty in a court of law. In other words, you take them to court, and they're guilty.
Right.
What do you do with them? I would execute them. And people say, oh, that's too much. That's harsh. You want to stop it?
Right.
Every law enforcement officer I've spoken to and asked, what if we made the penalty death for trafficking in children and women, trafficking drugs, bring it in? Oh, well, gee, it would stop.
Yeah. You can just look at the countries with the harshest penalties on crime and then look at the crime statistics. I saw in Singapore the other day, they're like publicly caning people, and they don't have any crime in Singapore. Nobody wants to be publicly caned. And so I'm certainly for much, much harsher criminal penalties for sure, especially when it comes to trafficking women and children. I mean, it's just like the most heinous, evil type of crime that you could even imagine.
But if you're losing 300,000 dead a year in the United States to fentanyl,
right,
what are you going to do? Don't we have an obligation to protect our citizens?
Well, that's the only obligation of the government, right?
Yeah, but even if we have to protect the citizens from themselves. I mean, obviously, the choice to use drugs is a bad one. Fentanyl is deadly.
Right.
We can't stop everything, but should we not try to stop that?
And unfortunately, this is a much deeper conversation, but, I have kids, teenage kids, and unfortunately, they know several people who have died of fentanyl in high school. None of them went to do fentanyl. They were doing,
something.
They thought they were doing some other type of drug or pill, and it just happened to have the fentanyl in there. And so part of me thinks, well, I don't think, and I don't know the statistics on this, but from what I've seen personally, like nobody's going out to do fentanyl. It's that all the other drugs are so underground that they accidentally get it. And so maybe if we had more liberal drug laws like you see in other countries where teenage kids weren't going underground to get something and then accidentally dying, maybe that could stop it. But that's a whole deeper conversation.
The societies that experiment with this sort of thing have produced some interesting outcomes. Obviously, China was forced to accept opium at gunpoint by the Royal Navy. And we, the Vanderbilts and others, made billions of dollars from the opium trade that almost destroyed China as a nation. And so they subsequently implemented very harsh measures to stop the opium epidemic. More recently, you can go to a place like the Netherlands and see large numbers of people that are engaged in all this sort of legal activity. My only experience with the Netherlands was with the military, and it was terrible. And they were as remote from readiness to fight and kill anybody as almost anyone I've ever seen.
Right.
They're not bad people, but I think this sort of drug dependency or use for it, it's a dangerous thing. If you're trying to maintain an effective society, you're trying to organize, train, and educate people to be productive members of society, you're never going to have 100% success. But when you do that with drugs, you're probably going to have a lot less success.
Yeah.
I don't know. My friends out in Colorado tell me that it's been a disaster.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up, man. We've covered so much ground, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Maybe to kind of bring this kind of together and summarize this for sort of my main audience, thinking about macroeconomic and business owners, investors. When you think about this and the shifting world order that we've talked about, maybe the U.S. kind of reaching the end of its rope, NATO potentially falling, these different conflicts that we have around the world, what would you think for the average, investor entrepreneur? How should they be thinking about this over the next 5 to 10 years? Like, how would you be preparing for these shifts if you were in their shoes?
Well, I would tell investors 2 things right off the bat. Demand that laws be enforced. Law enforcement is critical. We were very successful economically, largely because we had almost perfect rule of law in the United States.
Right.
Now, I'm not talking about every jury trial was wonderful. What I'm trying to say is that people came to this country, and I've talked to so many from different places, and I said, what strikes you as most important about the United States? They said, oh, you could do business here.
Yeah.
I said, really? Oh, yes. You don't have to bribe anybody. You're not paying people under the table.
Right.
And you put your money down and you get what you paid for and so forth and so on. So the first thing, number one thing is demand law be enforced.
Rule of law.
The second thing I would tell them is end all these overseas military interventions. Dump this sanctions regime. We have something like 32, 33 countries under sanctions because somebody on the Hill or somebody in the State Department decide, well, we don't like them because they said mean things here or they didn't treat women nicely or they put bags on their heads. Get rid of all that crap.
Yeah.
In other words, get back to doing business with people, not trying to impose our way of life, our values, our structure, our system on others. If you could get those 2 things straight, which is halt the wars, stop the sanctions, and enforce the law, I think that would be enormously beneficial to business because right now, China has said, well, if you're going to behave this way, you're not going to get any rare earths. Now, personally, I'm thankful because that makes us finally pull our heads out of rectal territory and think seriously about, rare earths. Yep. But having said that, what possible reason do we have for that kind of hostility with China? The answer is none. And by the way, if you change your approach there, and then you turn to the police agencies in China and say, we need some help, because we know that fentanyl and its ingredients and so forth are shipped, down to Mexico and even into the United States. We'd like your help with that. You'd be surprised. You'll probably get it. Everybody has problems. Mm-hmm. China has got 1.4 billion people in it. Good Lord. Xi wakes up every morning hoping that he can hold that country together.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah, good points. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end. We'll wrap it up there. Again, Colonel, I really appreciate you sharing all your insights and your experience and knowledge with us today. Anything that I know you create a lot of content here on, you're constantly making the rounds, and I appreciate your hard work there. Anything you want to point attention to that people should be paying attention to or that they can follow you with?
Yeah, if you get a chance, go to the website nationalconversation.org. We developed that last year. It's brand new. It's a nonprofit. It's an attempt to try and chart a course into the future that is not part of the Democratic or Republican parties. Frankly speaking, I'm one of these people that thinks we've reached a point where, contrary to what they say, whatever you do, you're going to get pretty much the same outcome from both parties. Mm-hmm. We need a different way forward, a different set of principles. different set of ideas, different set of priorities. The national conversation is designed to attract people to help us figure out what that is. It's not something where you come in, it's not, what is it? Oh gosh, the Tom Cruise religion, what's that called?
Scientology.
Yeah, we're not turning you into something like a Scientologist.
Right.
What we want to do is have you join us for various meetings that we're going to hold all over the country. Meetings and dinners. We're going to have speakers, and then we want to hear what you have to say. I still think that's the best way to get forward. You can't, if you try to develop a new party structure, a new third party, from the top down, it will fail.
Right.
You need leadership, but you need people from the bottom up who are committed to it.
Yeah.
And everybody is saying, it can't be done, it can't be done, it can't be done. There's too much money in these other parties. Well, that's what people thought about the Republican Party, and it didn't happen that way. The Republicans actually came into power. And that's because of events over which you and I have no control. We don't know what will happen in the next 12 months. And suddenly people, based on the events, may decide, gosh, these people over here with the national conversation, they've got a good idea. We need to go that way.
I love that. I love that. Good idea. I'm gonna make sure we'll link all that down below. I'm gonna join it. I want to be involved in that. A national
Well, Mark,
conversation is
thanks
good.
a lot, and good luck with those teenagers.
Okay. Thanks so much. All right. Bye.